My guest today is Raffaella Sadun. Raffaella is a professor of business administration at Harvard Business School. Professor Sadun's research focuses on the economics of productivity, management, and organizational change. She has recently been a member of the Italian government's task force against coronavirus.
Hey, Raffaella, great to see you. It's fantastic that you could come into the show and tell us about all the interesting research on how companies are reacting to the pandemic and the future of management and all that. So thanks for being here.
Oh, it's lovely to see you, Luis.
Excellent. So I wanted to start with some recent research you've done that basically aims to discuss how companies are managing and how they should be managing their reaction to the shock. So you basically have discussed what kind of companies are being more resilient to the shock and how are they trying to figure out how to manage the new normal. Why don't you tell us a bit about how management and the management practices in the pandemic are interacting?
Sure, yeah. So I should tell you, this is like a type of work that is based on interviews with, we have about 50 to 60 companies all based around the world. It's a little bit different from the type of research that you discussed with John, where we go for thousands of interviews. But when we were running this project, it was about May and April. We thought that it was very important to get into the systematic case studies of organizations that seemed to be at the frontier. So organizations that were reacting to the pandemic in a positive way. And we wanted to go and chat with them in a systematic way, but sort of case studies to understand how they were reacting and how they were sort of reopening just after the lockdown. So this is just to say that I would say that the last word on management within the pandemic is being written now. The data is being collected now. But I thought that these interviews give you a hint in the sense that organizations that were reopening were able to do so through primarily investments in what we would say intangible capital, the ability to organize the company and reorganize the company very quickly. For example, you have with the lockdown, many companies had to do very quickly to e-commerce, and the typical standards of channels of trade were closed for many organizations, and so they had to quickly pivot into e-commerce. To do that, you need some intangible capabilities inside the firm that allow you to redeploy workers or find very quickly new information and use it to your advantage. So the first thing that we saw was that this organizational agility, if you like, was really a key ingredient to making these initial adjustments to the pandemic. Another type of this type of intangible capital that I thought was really striking from these interviews was the ability to effectively communicate with the workforce. As you know, we all went to a sort of working from home status from for some organizations. It was at 0 to 100 in a matter of days. And so talking with these organizations, it was really interesting to see how do you do that, right? And they were able to, I think, communicate, first of all, why they were doing it. They were able to show support because some employees, obviously, while we see working from home as getting freedom and getting rid of the commute, for many of us, working from home meant managing multiple responsibilities and many different things. And so one common narrative that emerged from these interviews was this ability to get close to the employee and understand that there was a process of adjustment and that you were not going to be monitored 24 hours a day just because you were working on the computer, but that the organization was going to help you adjust, maybe learn new skills and adapt. And from a strategic standpoint, these are all things that have to do with the organization. But then, of course, there is also your ability to redefine who you are as a company. What's your value proposition, and why should companies come to you? And so, understanding where you stand relative to your competitor and how you can keep your customers was definitely something really important. So, as an economist, we ended up catching on things that we typically don't measure at scale. But I think it's, in a sense, reassuring because it gives you hope that there was some margin of adjustment, even in the middle of this huge crisis.
So in that same line, your colleague from across the river from the economics department, Paul Antras, told us that he thought the value chains were quite resilient and that very fast after the shock, when things open up, everything is back to normal. Is your sense that this is true overall for businesses? That do you think is there going to be a durable shock that will take long for companies to recover from, or do you think that like Paul in value chains, that in the whole supply chain, that we will see relatively fast recoveries in the way businesses operate once this nightmare is all over?
So I think the key word is going to be that heterogeneous response.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that in part also what we measured was the fact that remember, I told you these were organizations that were at the frontier. So, organizations that even prior to the pandemic had something special about them. My sense is that one possible outcome of this crisis is that we're going to see an increase in the polarization of outcomes across companies. And that perhaps has also to do with the resilience of supply chains. One, as you know, Chiara Criscuolo at the OECD, right? Even prior to the pandemic, we were observing that companies, in terms of their productivity, had started to diverge, right? With companies that were able to improve their productivity and do so increasingly over time, and companies that were remaining behind. My sense is that this pandemic might be a force that actually accelerates that dynamic of polarization. Mm-hmm. And that might have to do, that might be reflected in the resilience of the supply chain. It may also be reflected in, the productivity of the firms themselves.
You have not only, I mean, this is a very, let me just go back 1 second. This research that our colleague Chiara Criscuolo and others have been conducting, it was pretty shocking, right? How we have seen increasing performance differences between companies that apparently look not from the outside not very different. Do we have an explanation for why has this been going on and why has it been increasing? Is it new technologies kind of increase differentials between companies? Is that what we are seeing?
I think that there are different stories and they might all be at play. One story might be, as you say, technology. Why? Well, because we know that technology, there are economies of scale in certain technological investments. And so it may well be that for companies that have made these investments in technology early on, or that have committed to a certain type of approach towards business, e-commerce is one of them, then it's very hard for smaller organizations to replicate the same type of productivity gains and performance. So I believe that this is true. It might be true specifically in some sectors. Retail comes to mind as one of the primary examples of where these technological investments and economies of scale really played a very important role. But it's also playing in other sectors. So that is one. I think another piece, which again goes back to the organization, is that sometimes learning sort of accumulates, right? And you might start with learning how to use that technology, but then you might also learn how to codify new knowledge that is created inside the company and redeploy that knowledge in other aspects of the firm. And as you know, all these complementary investments, they can have this sort of they magnify an initial productivity differential. One of the nicest examples of this is a study that Michela Giorcelli, who's an economist at Berkeley, did on some early managerial training. It was part of the Marshall Plan just after the Second World War. And she was able to study how companies performed after being exposed to a pretty intense managerial training. If you look at Michela's results, you will see that the productivity effects accumulate over time. And they're sort of explosive. And you look at these results for the first time, you say, well, my God, this cannot be true. But then you start understanding that improving in one side of the company, start, as I said, with technology, you go to HR, you go to marketing, and then these virtuous cycles start to kick in.
So it actually would be a very good thing if some of these European recovery money, like the Marshall Plan was used in the past, was actually used for productivity enhancing management training, making people learn managerial techniques, right? I mean, that would be clearly productivity enhancing.
Oh my God. I mean, I think I don't understand why we're not doing it already. It's one of those things that it may not be as fancy and as shiny as building a new bridge. But can you imagine what we could do today, especially for small and medium enterprises, where there is a lot of knowledge about the business, but there might not be a lot of knowledge on how to scale the business or how to adjust to these new technological trends or these new HR needs. All the existing evidence shows that this productivity training may be, or managerial training, if you like, may be a low-cost way of unlocking productivity gains. And what is really interesting is this, even more recent research that suggests that sometimes this even putting entrepreneurs together. I teach at Harvard Business School, so I am biased here, but you don't need to send them to Harvard Business School. Put the entrepreneurs together, have some entrepreneurs who figure it out, teach the other entrepreneurs. And I think at the very least, we should try and evaluate what happens if you do that.
Okay, I will try to pass that on. So Rafaela, a second aspect of management that you've been looking at has been public sector management, and you've focused a lot on healthcare systems, which, I mean, it's very lucky because healthcare systems have become extremely important. And also, we see big differences in the performance of different healthcare systems in different countries, in different segments of care. What are the lessons that we know about healthcare systems and healthcare management, and what are the lessons about healthcare management that have been particularly important to how the systems have handled the pandemic? What do we know? How should we manage hospitals and doctors?
Yeah, so again, this is one of those areas where you need a lot of research, and I don't think we have a silver bullet because it's such a complicated sector that you need to, there are probably multiple drivers of clinical performance and quality of clinical performance. So what we know in a steady state pre-pandemic, what we know is that what happens inside hospitals in terms of organization of the work of the clinicians, for example, the ability to monitor what is happening, to pick up problems, discuss problems, and sort of use this Toyota-like continuous improvement approach. We know that organizations and hospitals that excel in that area of, in that domain of processes tend to have better clinical performance. We know that this is an association. I don't think that we have causal evidence at scale right now. We know of organizations like Victoria Mason, the Virginia Mason hospital in the US, for example, that have completely been converted to lean and quality of care that outperform other hospitals. So I think we have a lot of cross-sectional evidence on that. We need the causal evidence. In terms of the pandemic, I've been observing what's happening. We are collecting data. I think what we will know, in the next year or so, what type of practices have helped hospitals go over this crisis. But if you look at the case studies that are emerging, for example, the Lodi hospital in Italy, which was one of the areas that was hit by the pandemic early on with a tsunami of cases, I read the account of how they reorganized the hospital during the pandemic, And I found a lot of the practices that we studied earlier in steady state, where, it's the ability to reorganize your human capital. They created teams. They realized that they were short-staffed. And so they created teams, but the composition of the teams, who you put touring the grounds, how you communicate the information that is being collected, all this information was super valuable for them to reorganize very quickly. They were briefed, by the way, from the military. So lots of the techniques that the military had deployed in emergency situations, they proactively sought out the military and brought them in. So I think that we are learning that there was a lot of this organizational initiative and organizational differences that played some role throughout the pandemic.
In this segment where there is so little competition, really, in particular when it's public sector, but even in private sector hospitals, one thing that we could expect is that the heterogeneity persists much more. If a hospital is not doing very well, it can continue not doing very well for decades, and nobody might notice. What are the mechanisms that lead hospitals to become better and to learn, etc.? Is it just that, well, some hospitals are lucky and get a good manager, or how can we kind of make these systems improve? And this is true of hospitals, and it's true of the whole public sector largely.
Yeah. So in the research that we did with John Van Renen, Nick Bloom, and Renata Lemus, where we looked at this heterogeneity in management practices across hospitals, we found that human capital was a very important factor. So in our research, when the hospitals had this combination of clinicians trained in managerial degrees, not necessarily MBAs, those hospitals tended to have better management practices and also better clinical outcomes. What I think is interesting is we measured these skills at the middle level of these organizations. So these were clinicians that had a responsibility position in these middle layers. I think this is actually crucial because if you want hospitals to be managed well, it's going to be very hard to adopt a top level model as you might have in a private company, where if you like the CEO goes and decides precisely, you were saying that it's not a sector exposed to competition, but also it's not a sector where necessarily people are, there are heterogeneous motivations that come into people who work in a hospital. And so I think here the issue is understanding also not just what to do. This managerial training may be an avenue to improve hospital quality, but also where to intervene. And whether you want to start with the head of these organizations, like the CEOs, or whether you want to have something that is more systematic at the middle level of these organizations. I personally tend to believe, on the basis of the research that I've done, that these middle layers might be more effective than the top layers.
Yeah, it's true that you can start there, but I wonder if people don't get demotivated when their bosses are not professional, even if they are very good. They're an organization that doesn't really have good practices from the top. I mean, that would be something to study, I guess.
Well, we did a little bit of that in the NHS. We looked at the NHS. As you know, the NHS tried to introduce these new public sector management principles in the system, which included having more metrics being measured, being visible in terms of the outcomes. And part of it also consisted in giving more responsibility to the CEOs of the hospitals, who were appointed by the hospital board, sort of mimicking this labor market for CEOs. And, we got into the evaluation of this approach, honestly, thinking that perhaps there was an avenue for leadership to have an impact. And in fact, not much. So we didn't find that CEOs seemed to have a very important effect for the performance of these English hospitals. If you look at the numbers, it's also very clear why. The managers are rotated every 3 years. They have to change hospitals. Sometimes they have both political objectives and clinical or hospital specific objectives. So to me, this tells us that if we want to get serious from a policy perspective on this, it's going to be hard to just imitate one side of the private sector. The reform has to be, more comprehensive and also not as influenced by political objectives rather than, performance or clinical objectives.
The fast rotation, for sure, you mentioned, seems also a big problem, right? Because you can go for a superficial, in 3 years, you can go for a superficial improvement, but not for a deep cultural change or something of your hospital, right? We saw it in private sector companies, I guess, as well, like BP, etc. The people, when they rotate so fast, they just make the change and go, right?
Yeah, I mean, how can you tell a doctor that has been there for 15 years, I am the new CEO now, follow the lead? Yeah. I mean, it's...
So similar organization, and I know you haven't been looking at it as much for the pandemic, but you did look at it before, which is the school, another public sector organization that has a lot probably to improve in terms of how it's managed in many countries. What are the basic principles that seem to matter in schools? Are they the same principles as in other places? And what are systems that you could say, well, look, these are systems that have these principles?
Yeah. Look, we were surprised because when we did this analysis in schools, we found that the similar principles that appear to be important in manufacturing and in healthcare, which goes back to, the ability to monitor, communicate, think about problems proactively, and manage the workforce well, they applied. We found lots of variation in schools too, even within the same country. So that tells you that schools, if you like, are not entirely determined by the type of institutional settings in which they operate. So first, there was variation. And second, where we could measure this sort of value-added outcomes, which is a little bit the gold standard in the education research, we again found association between better management and better student outcomes. So going back to your question, we found similarities in terms of the practices, similarities in terms of the correlation of the practices with the outcomes. But again, I want to be, I want to make sure that we don't underestimate how complicated it would be to really change the way in which schools are managed and organized. And in fact, if you look at the evaluations and experimental evidence that is emerging in schools, they show that there is tremendous inertia, and it's unclear whether a top-down intervention. Recently, there was an evaluation of a top-down intervention in India, for example, that tried to improve the way in which schools were assessed and monitored, and found very little evidence of outcomes. And I think is again this idea that perhaps we sort of underestimate how difficult it is for organizations to internalize and really implement the practices. These are not things that are just formally there, but these are practices that have to be implemented. And almost you almost want a cult. You almost want some sort of religious belief that measuring what happens is really important for how how well students fare or how well our clinicians fare. So
you want if you could, it's not just hanging it on the wall, right? You have to get people to internalize it. But if you could make them internalize, what would be the key principles that you would want them to take? Measuring is important. What else?
I think it's measuring and also making sure that measurement captures problems. This is the key thing. It's not measuring for the sake of measuring or for the sake of remuneration. There has to be, if you like, a mindset that tells you if you are on the shop floor, in the cases of a firm, you can tell me what's working and what's not working. This problem will be communicated and we will think about ways to resolve it. So that's, I think, a second piece from an operational standpoint that is on paper very easy and in practice so hard to achieve. If you think about what needs to be there for this magic to happen. And then there is a whole
have to feel comfortable raising problems, and normally they feel they're bringing bad news and they don't dare to raise problems. Is that the main obstacle to this kind of?
I think that one issue is definitely the sort of hierarchical relationship that sort of impede this level of communication. In part, it's because, there is a risk that if you suggest improvements that effectively, lead to greater productivity, you always think about how is my job going to change as a consequence. That's also, a second type of considerations. But I think that the fear of retribution is, as you were mentioning, a very important one. There is also a whole sort of set of practices that have to do with the management of human capital, which I know you studied as well. And, this idea of promoting, hiring for merit, or being able to recognize who is really a valuable worker, and, use incentives, monetary and non-monetary incentives appropriately, removing people if needed. I mean, these are all sort of things that complement this, complement a lot of the management practices on the operational side too. And they're hard. It's really hard to do.
So Rafaela, if we look beyond hospitals and schools, I mean, the public sector is growing a lot with the pandemic. There is going to be a lot of students, quite a bit of time. They're going to be, the state's role is going to be crucial in the economy. And I mean, one thing that worries me and that worries others is that, well, the state is quite inefficient in many countries. The public sector often is unable to make fast decisions, etc. How more broadly would you think of improving the public sector? What would be the things that if you could do, you would say, well, we need to do these that are feasible and that are interventions that you think would work broadly beyond hospitals and beyond?
Luis, you're asking me one of the most complicated questions. I would say, this is also some discussions that I've been part of in Italy. And my sense is there is also a need to probably select people who work in the public sector differently. There is probably going to be a need for some generational renewal. I am not sure that it's possible to change the culture of the mindset or the mindset of public sector employees that perhaps have not been used to a different way of doing things for the longest time. So I think one starting point would be to start by changing the way in which you recruit people into the public sector. It doesn't necessarily, Oriana Bandiera does all this amazing work looking at, should you just select people on the basis of their skills or their motivation, right? And she finds that these two things are actually complementary. So you should aim to have people that believe in the public sector mission, but also have the capabilities to advance within the public sector or, do well. So I think that that leads to the discussion of how you remunerate, also how you compensate people, which is clearly an important one. But then, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I do believe that training here would be potentially also very important. I'm not talking about pro forma training, check the boxes or just pretend that you're watching a video. But this sort of training of, that leverage on the network of maybe public sector employees that are already functioning at a certain level and disseminate what's feasible, I'm not sure that this avenue has been tapped. And if I think about public sectors that are relatively more efficient, I believe that in fact they have created this sort of elite public servants that then are used across different parts of institutions. So I'd love to see more and different training there too.
Training is something that it's essential in many places, very encouraged, and in many public sectors they seem to do it, and in other countries it's basically non-existent, right? People just pass a state exam, they get into the job, and they never see a training material again. So, and I can see what you say, like not just box ticking, but actually making people learn new practices is hard. They need to internalize them, right? That's what is difficult about it. So let me go back to the private sector and the technological change. One of the most fascinating things that has happened with the pandemic is this idea that technological change got accelerated. We're doing this conversation on Zoom, which a year ago, I have to confess, I didn't know what Zoom was. I mean, if you asked me in November 19, I don't think I would have known what Zoom was. And now we cannot live without Zoom. We are living on Zoom. So we see less face-to-face meetings, much more long distance video conferencing, etc. What is your sense from what you have seen in companies, in the companies you talk to, etc., about first, to what extent these technological changes are here to stay, and second, what are the costs and the benefits? How do we think of what's lost and what's gained when we do this new way of teleworking and working distance conferences, distance meetings, etc.?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad I'm chatting about this with you, Luis, right? You're an expert in communication, so I'd love to hear your thoughts too. But, I tried to measure this. I tell you how we did it.
Okay.
We worked with a large email provider, and we measured what happened to communications, business communications in terms of emails and meetings before and after lockdowns.
Wow.
So we use that data set that has like 3 million data points. Obviously, we don't know what's in the data for confidentiality reasons, but at least you could see, how does communication vary once everybody now has to communicate virtually. And what you see there is this increase by 20% of the meetings. So we are all obviously spending our time interacting virtually now, that's obvious. Our span of the working day has increased. So on average, we tend to log in and log off. We have increased our working day by an hour in general. And these trends tend to be quite persistent. So I'm thinking about this and I'm saying, one obvious reason is that we are replacing these extemporaneous interactions virtually. I think that the implications are fascinating. And again, they go back to heterogeneity. So for people who do their work by themselves and don't need to really coordinate or communicate with other individuals in the company or outside the company, this shift in communication probably means more flexibility, more ability to, go for a jog or take care of whatever you have to take care of and then log in. But I'm thinking about managers. And as you know, managers mostly coordinate information flows. And so to me, these increases that we've seen in these formal communications imply that somehow having lost the physical locus of interactions, the office, we are trying to regain touch and coordination through these virtual means. The translation is probably not going to be one-on-one, one-to-one. There is a lot that gets lost. And in fact, there is a lot of knowledge that is typically, not codified. And companies are trying to shift their employees to codify as much as they can so that they can have asynchronous check-ins and so forth. My sense is that the other risk is that, all the part that has to do with creativity and interrupting each other. You've been remarkably polite, right? You're not interrupting me now, but in person, you would have interrupted me 50 times already.
Yes,
so
yes.
All this gets lost.
There is a slight delay, which means that if you want to interrupt, it already comes late. So it means that there's more taking turns, right? Absolutely. There is a more formal and more...
a little bit more boring too. I mean, I like being interrupted when
people,
that's okay.
So actually, now you're talking about asynchronous and synchronous. Let me talk about one particular type of organization, which is universities that you and me both know well. And you're teaching at Harvard Business School, you're teaching people who are in these very dynamic case situations. They're all interacting, all raising their hand, interrupting each other, contributing points. What's your sense about how teaching has changed, and what have you gained and what have you lost? Your personal impression. How are you feeling about it?
Well, I can tell you back in August, I was terrified. because we are used to this very dynamic classroom, and it feels like you're giving a performance every time. And how are you going to do that? And I think that here, as it happened in many parts of the economy, we've seen a lot of innovation in online teaching, which with techniques that have been shared. So right now, I think that we've made a lot of progress, and I'm not as terrified as I was before. The one thing that is really interesting is how the composition of the executive students is changing, for example, where we have more women participating in some of the executive education courses, because you can take it while you have other responsibilities. So there is something about this discovery of the different pedagogies that I think is really exciting, and probably has kept many people who are teaching awake throughout the summer, but we're getting there.
You think it's actually being effective? Students are feeling that they interact, and that there are some elements that will be kept probably, right? Pre-recording lectures maybe will be something that will be done after the pandemic. Are there practices that you think are here to stay?
I think definitely. I think this idea that you can have a much broader audience, that, for reasons that are related to different, types of circumstances, that is very attractive. I think the idea that you can, you can engage students differently is something that probably will stay. I would say, again, we are talking about a very selective part of the population, of the student population. I worry about all the students that are not going to be maybe as technologically savvy, or that are not having access to the technologies that would allow you to be a full participant into these classes. And so I think, again, we go back to a situation where it's very likely that for the top of the distribution, this shift implies something that is almost as good as the real thing. But I am confident that we've also deteriorated the student experience massively for a big chunk of the population. And that worries me.
Yeah, in particular for little kids who, doing by Zoom classes when you're 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, I can imagine it's a big challenge to keep a kid like just sitting there looking at the screen for 3 or 4 hours.
Yeah, but it's not just kids, right? It's also I think it's a big chunk of society that is not being, has not accessed any of this
to education. Absolutely. So let me for the final couple of questions, ask me about an experience that you have had that I think is potentially very, very useful for people watching, which is you've looked carefully at how Italy has been behaving. You've been in the expert committee that Prime Minister Conte named. I don't want you to go into any of the details of what happened inside, but whatever you can tell us about what you have learned about, I think part of what we have all discovered with this pandemic is how little we understood and how little we even understand now, right? It's been a huge learning experience for the entire world. Even now, countries are widely diverging in what they're doing. Germany and the Netherlands going into lockdown. Other countries are open for Christmas. It's been really kind of a chaotic response in many places. What do you think? How did this experience of being in this committee, and what did it teach you, and what did you learn about how to do better next time? As countries here, that's
yes, yeah. As countries, it's hard. I mean, look, I was part of this task force as a consultant, not as a politician. So we had the luxury of making suggestions that seemed, non-controversial on paper. You have to digitize the economy. You have to improve the public administration. We had 120 suggestions, which, none of that would look controversial if you think about it from a growth perspective, right? Human capital, technology, a better public sector. So I learned that, if you like, a lot of the obstacles, you don't have to go very far to understand what the obstacles for growth and for overcoming this pandemic are. Even from a sort of, healthcare perspective, we sort of been repeating continuously since March that you need testing, tracing, and isolation. And, you lay out what the solutions are, and then you realize that there is this tremendous inertia and this political economy of, how to allocate the funds and who gets to control whom. And my biggest realization, especially having been inside, is that it's not about the what to do, it's about how you do it. And unfortunately, what I was hoping that this pandemic would allow us to make the shift towards almost like a second World War type of mentality. We're all in it together. I think that unfortunately we are seeing a lot of this factionalization and internal divides that are guiding the political process, and that's a real shame.
So this what you're pointing out, I mean, obviously, having also been on the political side of things, this is something I'm very much learning, right? We tend to think in academia that if you just laid out the solution clearly, and if people just were to understand what you mean, then change would happen. And when you're in politics, you realize that very often the solutions are there in plain sight, and that the problem is not just knowing what the solution is and understanding what is the problem, but actually implementing it and making sure that people want to do it. I think that it's also true in companies, as we said before, as you said before, when we were talking about, middle managers trying to learning or being able to conduct the right changes. So, what do you think is the right way to kind of approach this organizational change? I mean, not just in the state, but in companies, when there are all this political resistance, etc. How do we integrate all these nice ideas from your research or management practices, from what we know about what works? And I'm thinking of a paper. I don't think you were co-author of Nick Bloom in that one. The India paper, were you there in that paper?
No.
So
No.
Nick Bloom, a co-author of both of us, was basically, okay, we're going to India, we're explaining people how management should be done. We're putting all these companies, and all these companies did it, and they hired consultants, they got all these changes. But you see that as time goes by, and you see that as the paper moves to its conclusion, that a lot of these changes are being dissipated, that potentially they don't stay. So what is your sense of how does organizational change happen, and how do we make sure that organizational change stays and sticks?
Yeah, look, this is again, you could write books about just, right? And all that. So I came to the conclusion that I think the issue is, why is it hard? It's hard because at the same time, you need strong guidance and sort of some sort of top level vision of where you want the organization to go. There is a lot of, BS type of thing that is being said about superstar CEOs and visionaries and all that. But, at the end of the day, that matters because you're asking people to change their routines and to do things the way you do it. You can't fully control or compensate people for every action, And so I think that is actually necessary. The issue and the trick, the art, becomes when you go from this top-down vision to letting people find their own way. So it's this combination of having a strong guidance and then letting people, instead of ordering people, but letting people understand that it's in their best interest to follow your guidance and to change their practice. So we go back to, we said, how do you change a hospital in 2 or 3 years? How do you change an organization in 2 or 3 years? These things take time and take a lot of effort. It's communication, it's consistency. Sometimes it happens, but it's a mixture of being in control and understanding when not to be in control too, which is again something that you studied, right?
Yes. Have you seen, apart from this study I was mentioning, a good recent study where people actually do what you're saying, like actually get an organization to really change and people to get this buy-in from below and
Yeah, I keep studying this. I have to write case studies because that's how I teach.
know.
So
Yeah.
I've done several case studies actually where these things happen, and one of them was a hospital in New York, which was completely turned around. This is the NYU Langone Hospital, was completely turned around through this actually through an electronic dashboard. That's that is something that. Resembles your study on the ICT in police, right?
Yeah.
The CEO created through working really with the data warehouse people a massive dashboard that in principle would allow him to micromanage and observe what everybody else was doing. But the trick and the ability was to give this dashboard in the hands of the middle managers and let the middle managers use it for their own interest. And so over time, there was an adoption of a technology and also massive improvements in the clinical standards of the hospital and so forth. That's one example of this combination of really strong direction from the top with the understanding of what needs to happen for people to follow your guidance.
Yes, that was indeed so in this police paper that we did, that you're mentioning, that having a dashboard where people can see how crime is evolving, what are the main changes from previous weeks, and at the same time giving them the authority and they're making them accountable for changing these things. That combination seemed to, maybe that's the right combination. Maybe that works broadly in getting people to change the way they're doing things, that they can actually see themselves having this impact.
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much, Rafaela. It was really fantastic to talk to you and to hear how organizations can improve, and hopefully coming out of this pandemic, a lot of the lessons that we learned from this year will help people develop better solutions and manage things better. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Stay well. I know that in Boston things are still not great with the pandemic.
Oh my God. Yeah, we'll see. Thank you, Luis.
Thank you very much.